Thank you very much for coming. It's so great to be here. This is the first conference that we created, and in so many ways, the most wonderful. You guys know for the last half dozen years, I really have taken O'Reilly away from thinking of ourselves as a book publisher or a conference producer, and instead a company that is trying to make the world a better place through technology, helping good futures to happen. And as a result, I often pepper my talks with quotes from futurists. You've probably heard me use this one, Ray Kurzweil, "I'm an inventor. I became interested in long-term trends because an invention has to make sense in the world in which it is finished, not the world in which it is started." And I've spent a lot of time trying to urge all of you in the open source community to think hard about the future of the cloud, starting with my very first talk on open source back in 1997, where I said, don't just think about Linux, think about the web, think about where it's taking us, and of course it's taken us a very, very long way. I've also used this one quite a lot, William Gibson's amazing quote, "The future is here, it's just not evenly distributed yet." It's a wonderful idea that the future is all around us. You guys are already living in futures that ordinary citizens, people around us haven't yet experienced. You know, open source was the first wave of a movement that transformed the world, where we learned to collaborate over the network, to work together in interesting ways. But when I thought about today's talk, I had another science fiction quote come back to me. It's from Harlan Ellison, from a book I read many, many years ago. It's a collection of short stories. I didn't even remember it. I just remember it being the introduction to a book he wrote. It was a book called "The Beast That Shouted Love at the Heart of the World." It was published in 1969, which is kind of scary to think back how long ago that was. But the quote needs a little bit of backstory. He wrote the introduction when he was in Rio, and he talked about the amazing statue of Christ the Redeemer up on the hill. And he talked about how this was this amazing, beautiful thing. It's actually apparently lit up from the Vatican once a year. There's a button in the Vatican where they turn it on, and it's like this glorious thing. But he said, but this is the Christ of the rich white people. And down in the shanty towns, there is the image of the black Christ. And there are the people who are so poor that they can't put food on the table, but they still find money for cheap candles to put in front of the Christ to ask him for salvation and for him to come down and save them. And then he finished the introduction with a powerful, powerful statement, which I remembered, and I went recently and I rebought the book on my Kindle app from my Android phone and reread it and wanted to share it with you. And it goes like this. He says, the bottom line of what I've rambled on about here is to tell you that as night approaches, we are all aliens down here on this alien earth. To tell you that not Christ, nor man, nor governments of men will save you. To tell you that writers about tomorrow must stop living in yesterday and work from their hearts and their guts and their courage to tell us about tomorrow before all the tomorrows are stolen away from us. To tell you that no one will come down from the mountain to save your lily white hide or your black ass. God is within you. Save yourselves. I remember that so powerfully. I was 14 years old or whatever when I read that. But it's like, he's not going to come down off the mountain. We've got to do it ourselves. And then he had a wonderful last line. He says, otherwise, why would you have traveled all this way? Just to be alone? And so that kind of brings me to what I've always loved about open source. It's about sharing. It's about how we come together to make important, hard things happen. People may remember that the open source revolution was first celebrated by Eric Raymond's essay, "The Cathedral and the Bazaar." But it was a series of essays that he wrote. And one of them was called "The Cornucopia of the Commons." And I think this idea of the commons, the value that we create together, is the heart of what's interesting about open source. And everything I've talked about since, Web 2.0, crowdsourcing, even now my current activism, which some of you probably heard about Gov 2.0, it's all about what happens when we work together and about how to build systems that make it easier for us to work together. You've also probably know that I've been using a lot of my advocacy time to tell people to work on stuff that matters, not just to build cool tech that's going to make you rich or make people have a good time, but to address some of the hard problems, because we've been living in kind of a bubble. We're in an incredibly favored time, and it may not always be that way. And we're going to really need the skills of working together to solve some of the hard problems, everything from the financial crisis to income inequality, oil prices, global warming, the decline in our education system, water scarcity, exotic diseases, aging populations, and soaring health costs. All this kind of stuff is really a problem. And we saw an amazing example of how tech can be brought together to change this after the recent Haiti earthquake. There was an amazing group gathered around partly through Instead and Crisis Commons, which was sort of a hackathon and wiki that was putting together these tools. But they found all these pieces that had been created. And so there's a wonderful open source system originally designed for tracking voter violence in Kenya called Ushahidi. It basically puts incidents on a map and on a timeline. And so they were using this to say, oh my gosh, there's people under a building here in Haiti. Except in a lot of the poor districts, there were no maps. So they couldn't say where things were. Oh, but guess what? The OpenStreetMap team showed up and started building open source maps of the slums of Port-au-Prince. Right? And then they were getting these, they got a short code, 4636, so people could sort of text in these messages for free. But then, wait a minute, the messages aren't in English, they're in Creole. The rescuers can't understand them. Well, so then they used Crowdflower and Amazon Mechanical Turk and Sahana to pull together the Haitian diaspora community from around the world to translate those messages in real time so that you could say there's 3 people under a building on this corner that was just mapped just now. So we could, get the rescuers there. Patrick Meyer, who's one of the founders of Ushahidi, was saying, I couldn't believe it. He said there were something like 3,000 pages of Skype chat logs as they were coordinating all the aid organizations. He said, and I couldn't believe that the United States Marines and the American Red Cross were taking direction from me. But this is this wonderful platform that Cory Doctorow once called the adhocracy. People just stepping forward to make something happen. Because of the tools that we as a community have built, these kinds of cooperative acts of heroism are possible. And so that's why I've been really fascinated by the possibility of technology to help us reinvent government. Because I think that government, too, is a mechanism for collective action. We've just forgotten that. So that's why I'm really excited about what the federal government is doing with, and actually at both state and local level as well, to create open data APIs, to create a platform for innovation. It's why I'm interested in groups like Open Source for America, which I'm an advisor to. It's why we have this open source health track at OSCON. There's some amazing stuff happening with open source as a tool for transforming our healthcare system. I'm also really interested in what's happening at the local level. You may notice the T-shirt I'm wearing matches this poster designed by an intern who's a volunteer working for a nonprofit that I'm on the board of called Code for America. We're going to actually hear a little bit more about that later. This is actually the preamble to the U.S. Constitution in binary, just a reminder of the continuity. We, the people, we put this country together. And this is still what we're trying to do. So we have to get beyond the model that we've fallen into of a kind of vending machine government, where we think government is just this thing we put in our taxes and we get out services. And instead, then we think that our participation is to complain. It took too long to get my candy bar. It cost too much. It was the wrong brand. And instead, start thinking about how to rebuild government as a tool for cooperation. Or just to route around government in the same way we've routed around all kinds of other dysfunctions in our society, to figure out how to build cool tools that make a richer civic life for ourselves. We were last night at an event here in Portland for a group called Civic Apps. And it was really cool seeing some of the things that were unique, so open source-ish. This guy had built this really cool iPhone app for finding the best food carts, because there's apparently a really rich food cart scene here in Portland. If there was ever an example of scratching your own itch and building software that could be just make the city better, here it was. It wasn't something that the government did. It was something the government was helping to enable. They opened up a bunch of APIs. There were also all these cool transit apps. And I think there's a real interesting frontier there, but really more of this is a lesson about how we can turn our skills in the direction of making the world a better place. And so I just want to urge you, as you think about what you're working on, don't just think about, building the next startup. Don't just think about figuring out how you're going to sell to the enterprise. Think about how you're going to build a better world. I want to connect the dots between what we do as an exercise in working together on open source projects and what we do as an exercise in working together to build a better society and building a better world. Because that happens when we do it together. Right? And that's just kind of brings me back to Harlan Ellison. He said, otherwise, why would you have traveled all this way just to be alone? Working together is the heart of what we do in open source. Working together is the heart of what we are going to need to do to solve the massive problems that are coming down the pike at us. And the skills that we have in this room are going to be increasingly important in making a better world. So I want to ask you to rise to that challenge. Thank you very much.